The movie starts in a town where a man named Paul was looking for things that he needs. Suddenly, alarms go off indicating danger, and Paul quickly leaves and moves through the town, hiding when necessary and avoiding loud noises and explosions. As the town becomes covered in dark smoke, Paul finally reaches an empty house on the outskirts of town, and here he reunites with his kids, whom he now has to take care of by himself. 15 years later, Paul's sons have grown into strong teenagers. They live in the same house and go out during the day to find necessary items, but they stay hidden at night. As the sun starts to set, Joseph covers the windows and calls their dog Rocco inside. Paul waits outside until Thomas returns, scolding him for being late. Thomas explains that he was helping their neighbors, the Rose family, who actually own a farm. The three of them then make sure to lock all the doors and windows before having dinner, and Paul scolds Thomas again, warning him that if he is late again, he won't be allowed to leave the safe area. Joseph teases his brother, but Paul intervenes and reminds them that they are men and not animals. After dinner, Paul watches his son play chess but gets distracted when Rocco starts scratching and growling at the floor. Taking it as a sign, Paul and Thomas go downstairs and are surprised by banging on the door, and it seems that the creatures outside were trying to get in, so they hold the door to prevent it from being forced open. After a few moments of shaking and pounding, the creatures give up and leave, and Tom confronts Joseph for not helping, but Joseph reveals that he was listening to gather information. There were 3 attempts to break the door. The first lasted 10 seconds, the second lasted 20, and the third was just a frustrated hit. Joseph believes the first attempt was a test, and the second was a real attempt, and the third was an act of frustration. The next day, they inspect the door and see all the scratch marks on the wood, and realizing that the door was weakened, Paul and his sons go out to find wood to reinforce it. They gather the wood and bring it back to the house. While Thomas cuts the wood, Paul checks on Joseph, who was working on something in the barn. After some prodding, Joseph admits that he's been trying to build a car, but he feels trapped and also scared. However, he hasn't been successful. Impressed, Paul takes a look and makes a few changes that finally make the car work. Excited, Paul takes the teenagers for a ride to teach them how to drive, and after an hour of exploring, they return home. Paul announces that the windows still need reinforcements, so he sends the boys to the river to find materials. Thomas becomes upset because he was promised a visit to the farm, but Paul insists that strengthening the windows is more important. The brothers leave in the car, and Thomas accuses Joseph of planning this to protect himself, and Joseph disagrees and Thomas gets out of the car near the farm, asking Joseph to pick him up on the way back. Back at the house, Paul finishes reinforcing the door and takes a break to smoke near a waterfall, and as he looks around, he notices a dark hole in the rocks. Meanwhile, Joseph goes to the river and ties himself to the car before descending into an old abandoned ship to search for supplies. Inside a locker, he finds a picture from an adult magazine, which momentarily surprises him, and as he continues searching, a swarm of bugs emerges from a pile of trash and start flying around, attempting to reach his skin. Joseph quickly leaves the area, and at the farm, Thomas helps with chores, but it becomes clear that his main reason for going there is to spend time with Charlotte, the owner's daughter. It is evident that Thomas and Charlotte have feelings for each other, and they take a walk together in the field. Charlotte shows Thomas a rope tied to a tree, explaining that when she was younger, she would tie herself to the tree to have more freedom to run, while still technically being connected to it. They also play a game where they shield wild theories about what caused the end of the world. When it was time for Thomas to leave, Charlotte gives him a tight hug, and with the sun setting, both boys needed to hurry back. Paul returns home and becomes worried when he finds Rocco but no signs of his sons, and Joseph gets inside a car, which initially doesn't start but eventually does. Meanwhile, Thomas was running as fast as he could and slips and falls into a hole in the ground. When Joseph reaches the spot to pick up his brother, he doesn't see him and continues driving home. Upon arriving, Joseph tells Paul about what happened, and Paul instructs him to go inside and lock everything up while he and Rocco search for Thomas. In the hole, Thomas regains consciousness, feeling sore all over, and he uses a lighter to look around and is shocked to see a creature reaching through a hole in the wall. The creature screams, alerting Paul and Rocco, and Thomas carefully takes out a small knife and stabs the monster's hand, causing it to retreat into the hole. However, when Thomas steps back, another creature suddenly appears and grabs his face. Thomas struggles to breathe, but before he passes out, Paul arrives and pulls the monster away, quickly killing it. After ensuring Tom was okay, Paul and Rocco discover a tunnel that leads them directly into the hole. It was too risky to run through the forest at this time, so they decide to stay in the hole until sunrise for protection and block the entrance. They can hear the creatures coming through the hole, so they prepare a flare. However, the ground starts to shake, indicating that the monsters are now moving underground and have trapped the group inside the hole by covering the exit with dirt. As Rocco continues to bark, the hole keeps rumbling, and Paul instructs his son and the dog to move back as he places the flare inside the opening in the ground, and when the creatures try to reach out, Paul sets off a small explosion, but unfortunately, he also gets injured. Back at the house, Joseph hears creaking sounds and starts formulating a plan, and a few minutes later, he sits in front of the main door with a rope tied to his chair and falls asleep. Soon, a creature moves the wood covering a hole in the door and reaches inside, extending its nail to test it if Joseph was truly asleep. When Joseph doesn't react, the creature enters the house, only for Joseph to reveal that he was pretending and pulls the rope. A cage falls from the ceiling, instantly capturing the creature, and proud of himself, Joseph covers the cage with a blanket and goes to sleep. The next morning, he becomes worried because the others have not yet returned, so he goes out in the car to search for them. Meanwhile, Thomas manages to dig through the dirt and reopen the entrance to the hole, and he pulls his badly injured father out, and Rocco follows the sound of the car to find Joseph and guide him back to his family. The brothers work together to carry Paul to the car and then to his bed in the house, and while discussing their next steps, Thomas notices a cage within a creature underneath a blanket, and Joseph quickly covers it again, explaining that light hurts the monsters. They treat Paul's wounds while Joseph shares that the creature took only 8 seconds to enter the previous night, the shortest time yet. Joseph also believes that there was another creature that left, and the creature's behavior is changing rapidly, leading Joseph to suspect that something is wrong. Thomas points out that the creatures are intelligent and they killed several of them in the cave the previous night, and that it's possible that they've come for revenge because Charlotte mentioned that they rarely visit the farm. Joseph disagrees, believing that only Paul killed the creatures, and to prove his point, Thomas tries to kill the creature in the cage. Joseph tries to stop him because he wants to study it, but in the struggle, the monster escapes and hides under the bed. When it peeks out, Rocco starts barking, causing the monster to transform and attack. Joseph restrains it, allowing Thomas to cut off its head with an axe. Joseph takes the creature's body to the barn to dissect it, but he gains no further understanding of what it could be. Thomas suggests taking Paul to Charlotte's farm because they have a better house and medicine, and Joseph doubts that the roses will help them, but Thomas insists that they can go. The brothers place Tom in the car and drive to the farm. However, Charlotte's parents refuse to take in someone who was severely injured due to the limited supply of medicine. Charlotte protests, but her pleas are ignored, and they agree to let Thomas stay, which means Paul and Joseph will have more resources at their house. Joseph walks in frustration, and Thomas follows him. They argue with Joseph blaming Thomas for their father's impending death, and angry, Thomas pushes his brother to the ground and starts choking him, but he quickly realizes what he's doing and stops. Joseph immediately gets in the car and drives away with their unconscious father, while Thomas remains with the family at the farm. Afterward, Charlotte shares some good food with Thomas and shows him some of her personal belongings, and they share a tender moment and a kiss, but their moment is interrupted when Charlotte's father enters and sends her to another room. Joseph notices the sheep running in fear and mounds of dirt scattered around, indicating that the creatures are moving underground. So he barricades and reinforces all the windows and accidentally discovers a hole under a carpet, confirming that the monsters are already inside the building. At the farm, Thomas searches for medicine in the kitchen. Charlotte gives him the medicine, and he thanks her with a hug, promising to come back. Thomas rushes out, but is stopped by a farm employee who accuses him of theft, and he tries to explain that Charlotte gave him the medicine, but the man doesn't believe him. The other employee ties Thomas up in the barn and plays music to cover up their intentions, and they grab his leg and one man prepares to shoot, but a hole opens beneath him, causing him to fall and miss the shot. The other men rush to check on him just as the creature emerges from the hole, and in the main house, Charlotte's parents wake up to a noise. The creature enters the room and attacks, and the candle falls, igniting a fire, while the monster jumps from the father to the mother, attempting to kill them both. The father manages to pull it back, and the mother runs out of the room. However, the creature pounces on her before she can escape. The monster undergoes a transformation and vomits on the woman before launching a deadly strike. Charlotte hears the sound of her parents being murdered and follows a trail of blood to the bathroom, where she finds her mother's lifeless body on the creature's back. At the barn, the men try to fight off the creatures but are unsuccessful. One by one, they are killed, and those who manage to escape are chased as more creatures arrive. The barn catches fire and Thomas breaks free from the furnitures he was tied to, and a creature finds him, but before it can attack, Charlotte shoots it down. They run out of the barn and Thomas sees the house on fire, and Charlotte explains that her parents are gone, so they decide to go to Thomas's place. Joseph throws furniture into the hole to buy some time and checks on his unconscious father. He kisses his forehead and gets ready to fight, and the hole in the door suddenly opens, revealing Thomas and Charlotte. Joseph admits he needs Thomas's help, but their conversation is interrupted by Paul waking up. Paul takes the medicine and tells his sons to keep fighting. Joseph shares his plan and they gather gas cans from the barn, while Rocco barks to alert them of danger. They also move an old freezer into the house, and Thomas and Charlotte reinforce the remaining windows, while Joseph creates a pile of furniture and pours gas on it. He then adds explosive objects and a burning cigarette. The pile covering the hole starts shaking, and a creature comes down the chimney, and another monster enters from the hole, and Thomas stabs it from behind. The creature attacks back, but Thomas retrieves his knives and stabs it in the head and kills it, and a third creature goes after Charlotte, but she shoots it down. The duo runs to rejoin Joseph, and they move the freezer again. The door opens behind them, revealing that Paul was up and covered in blood because he killed the chimney monster. Paul takes Charlotte's gun and shoots at the floor to hit the creatures downstairs. However, there were a lot of scary creatures coming toward him in the hallway. Paul kicks the first one and it causes a commotion, making most of the creatures fall through the floor. A few monsters were still left, but the teenagers quickly kill them to protect Paul, and Paul is impressed by how well they work together. After that, the three teenagers and their dog Rocco rush to a freezer for safety, and instead of going with them, Paul stays behind and closes the door to give them more time. Inside the freezer, the group hides while Paul thinks about a time when he held his babies and reassured them that everything would be alright. Suddenly, another group of creatures breaks in, but Paul distracts them, and eventually, a pile of furniture explodes, causing the whole house to collapse and catch on fire. The freezer starts rolling and keeps moving for a few minutes, and when it finally stops, the teenagers come out and desperately search for Paul in the wreckage. Suddenly, a creature jumps out, and they quickly run to their car and drive away as the monster chases them, covered in flames. Charlotte shoots at the monster, but her bullets don't do anything, and when the monster gets close enough, she hits it with her gun and it falls apart. A few miles later, the group stops the car and looks at the stars, and they had never seen them before because they were always inside at night. The next morning, they return to the house but decide not to rebuild it, and they gather any supplies they can find and bury their loved ones, saying their final goodbyes. The film comes to a close and we see the trio, along with Rocco, leaving in their car with the hope of finding a new home. And with that, the movie ends. We hope you enjoyed our video. Watch our next recaps on the screen, and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing recaps. See you on the next one.